All right. Well, let's turn in our Bibles this evening to Ezra chapter 6. Ezra chapter 6 as we continue our study on the theme, Rise Up and Build. Now that should immediately bring some type of picture to your mind, I hope. In Psalm 127 in verse 1, this powerful statement is made with which no doubt many are very familiar here. Except the Lord build the house, they labor in vain that build it. Except the Lord keep the city, the watchman waketh but in vain. And that's a key verse to remember in any important endeavor that you might have before you. Whether it is spiritual endeavors particularly, whether it is developing into a godly man or godly woman as an individual, or whether it's developing a household that's successful by God's standard, to include building a strong and God-honoring marriage and raising your children to love and serve the Lord, or whether it is the building of a strong, mature church. The Lord is the only one who can truly give success in those endeavors. Now, we can put forth our very best efforts into things, and they will be woefully inadequate every single time at best, because the power of the flesh can do nothing worthwhile. We just cannot accomplish anything that is going to be of eternal or spiritual value. It must be the Lord, His equipping, His empowering, or we simply will not be successful in anything. And we'll certainly never accomplish anything of eternal consequence. And again, only the Lord can do that. And so except the Lord build, then we labor in vain. And you can see again the dual effort. Well, the Lord has to do the building, but we also build along with the Lord, and He builds through us. So we have some things to do, but He is the one that has to enable that. And we have to carefully depend on Him for it. Now, everybody here has likely had some very important things that they've tried to accomplish that just seemingly dragged on and on and on with painstakingly slow progress. And even if you had the right desire for something to happen that was really good and righteous, such as winning a soul to Christ, or discipling someone, or serving in a church ministry, or having a God-honoring home, or any other number of things, but as you tried and tried and tried and tried, you found yourself running up against roadblocks constantly and unable to make significant headway. Or maybe you thought you made a little bit of headway. We're making some ground here at first, and then it seems like you're headed in the direction of victory, and then you seem to just run into a brick wall, and progress stops. And so one minute you are elated and rejoicing, and the next moment you're crushed. And then something seems to break free, and you seem to be making a bit of headway, and the next minute you run into another brick wall. And I feel like I'm describing probably some weekly processes that I go through in sharing the gospel with people, and seemingly initially having some good responsiveness to it, and then it comes to a grinding halt, and no further progress is made. And so, have you ever been through something like that? I'm sure that everybody here could attest to that. You want something so badly, but you hit wall after wall, and it drags on, and that's exactly what we've seen in the book of Ezra so far. Right? So, at the end of the Babylonian captivity of the Jews, around 538 BC, when King Cyrus gave the Jews permission to go home and rebuild their temple, they were thrilled. I mean, it was a tremendous victory. It was a great spiritual high, I guess you could say. And I mean, they were thrilled. They're excited. And some things are going to be accomplished. God had worked. They had endured the 70 years of captivity and judgment of God. And now when they heard that they were going to be able to go home, they were excited. They began dreaming, no doubt, about having their temple rebuilt and having it back and worshiping in the presence of God once again, which the old people maybe had done, but most, most of that time had never seen themselves in the temple. And so, so they thought that the hardships were over, and that in no time they were going to be worshiping the Lord in Jerusalem. But we've learned that it didn't happen nearly as fast or nearly as easily as the Jews had hoped, right? So they faced hurdle after hurdle and delay after delay in making progress. And so you can imagine, based on what we've considered so far, that it was tempting to lose hope, especially when the construction site at the temple sat idle for almost 16 years while nothing took place. But last week we saw in Ezra chapter 5 that God reinvigorated the work through the ministry of the prophets Haggai and Zechariah, those two minor prophets that came right at the end of the Old Testament era. And so God brought some very encouraging messages of hope and of progress through those men, and the people responded. They picked up their construction tools and they went out there and they got after it again. But as soon as they picked up those tools and they restarted the building process, almost immediately they faced another seemingly more significant hurdle when a man by the name of Tatnai, who was the Persian governor of the entire region that spanned from the Euphrates River all the way to the Mediterranean Sea, he showed up in town. And he showed up with quite an entourage to make sure that this was a sanctioned, legitimate project. And he wanted, of course, to make sure, as we mentioned, that the Jews weren't building a fortress with the intent of rebelling against Persia like the Jews' enemies, the Samaritans, were reporting. And so we ended last week with Tatnai the governor sending a letter to the new king, to Darius, asking, should I let the project continue or not? Now, excuse me. So since there were no modern means of instant communication in those days, the Jews just waited anxiously for months for that answer. I mean, there was no FaceTime and there was no instant messaging. There was not even snail mail like we might call it today, the postal service. And so they just had to send a dispatch rider, and they would ride those 800 miles all the way back and take months to get there. And then, of course, as we're going to see tonight, and then whatever the length of time was that it took to do the searching through the archives in different locations and find it and issue a new decree while all the other important things in the kingdom were still going on, and then riding all the way back to Jerusalem to deliver the news, right? So this was going to take many months for that to occur. And so no doubt the Jews who were on site were all wondering, will God open a way, or are things going to remain hard? Right? Will Darius shut the project down entirely, or will he let it continue? And thankfully, as we'll see tonight, all of that anxiety turned to joy in Ezra chapter 6 as Darius sent a very positive response. And the temple got finished, and worship was fully restored. And so we're going to see all those things happen in really quick sequence in this chapter. So this chapter is a massively significant moment in the lives of the people of Israel. And God did something truly incredible, right? So after Israel had gone away into captivity and it seemed like all hope was lost, he fulfilled his promises by bringing the people home to Jerusalem, allowing them to finish their temple, and demonstrating that he is sovereign. He is in control, and that he is faithful, and that he fulfills his promises. And in the process, of course, God reminds us that we can also explicitly trust his character at all times. He is still just as powerful. He is still just as faithful. He is still in absolute authority. He's as powerful as he has ever been. And we can also obey his will and expect to see him work mightily as we do what he's told us to do. So the story of Ezra chapter 6 begins in verses 1 through 12, where we see that God moved the heart of the king. So let's read the passage. It says, beginning in verse 1, "Then Darius the king made a decree, and search was made in the house of the rolls where the treasures were laid up in Babylon. And there was found at Achmetha, in the palace that is in the province of the Medes, a roll, and therein was a record thus written. In the first year of Cyrus the king, the same Cyrus the king made a decree concerning the house of God at Jerusalem. Let the house be builded, the place where they offered sacrifices, and let the foundations thereof be strongly laid. The height thereof 80 cubits, and the breadth thereof 80 cubits, with 3 rows of great stones and a row of new timber. And let the expenses be given out of the king's house. And also let the golden and silver vessels of the house of God, which Nebuchadnezzar took forth out of the temple which is at Jerusalem, and brought unto Babylon, be restored. And brought again unto the temple which is at Jerusalem, every one to his place, and place them in the house of God. So that's what the scroll said. Now therefore, Tatnai, governor beyond the river, Shethar-Boznai, and your companions, the Apharsachites, which are beyond the river, be ye far from thence. Let the work of this house of God alone. Let the governor of the Jews and the elders of the Jews build this house of God in his place. Moreover, I make a decree, this is Darius speaking, what ye shall do to the elders of these Jews for the building of this house of God, that of the king's goods, even of the tribute beyond the river, forthwith expenses be given unto these men, that they be not hindered, and that which they have need of, both young bullocks and rams and lambs for the burnt offerings of the God of heaven, wheat, salt, wine, and oil, according to the appointment of the priests which are at Jerusalem, let it be given them day by day without fail, that they may offer sacrifices of sweet savors unto the God of heaven, and pray for the life of the king and of his sons. Also I have made a decree that whosoever shall alter this word, let timber be pulled down from his house, and being set up, let him be hanged thereon, and let his house be made a dunghill for this. And the God that hath caused his name to dwell there, destroy all kings and people that shall put to their hand to alter and to destroy this house of God which is at Jerusalem. I, Darius, have made a decree. Let it be done with speed. So what a marvelous account. So as we enter this story, we see that first of all, Darius found a decree in verses 1 through 5. So again, if you remember from last week, Ezra chapter 5 left off with the ominous letter that Governor Tatnai sent back to King Darius asking, should I allow the Jews to continue building? And as I said last week, Darius was fairly new to the throne at this point in time. This is his 2nd year on the throne. And historically, he had just finished putting down multiple revolts across the Persian Empire during those first 2 years of his reign. And that wouldn't be uncommon. Often when a new king or emperor came to the throne, then people were going to test him, and they're going to see if they can take advantage of that time of weakness and of transition to rebel, to declare their independence, to pull away from taxation and those kind of things. And so that's been going on for 2 years. And so this letter that came in from Tatnai the governor really caught Darius's attention, and he immediately issued a decree to search the royal archives and determine if Cyrus had sanctioned the project as the Jews claimed, or whether this was a fortress that was being built that might signal a coming rebellion. So you might remember from some of the verbiage in the scripture as well, very frequently it'll talk about when a decree is made according to the laws of the Medes and the Persians, that it cannot be altered. And so future kings and emperors would also honor that. It was a part of their code in the Persian Empire, and that's one of the reasons that even Darius put so much stock in what Cyrus said here. So Cyrus is trying to ferret this out, right? And God was moving in the entire process. So as they began the search, we find in the text that they didn't find the decree in Babylon, which is where the central repository of the royal archives would have been contained. But then they continued the search. They didn't give up on it. They went to the palace at Akhmetha, it says, which was the capital of Media. So you might have heard of the Medo-Persian Empire, the Medes and the Persians. And so you have this united joint empire that all made up one kingdom or one empire, but at times the Medes were the dominant family, and at times the Persians were the dominant family, but it was all one united empire, right? And so they're looking in the kingdom of the Persians. They don't find it at Babylon. They go to the capital of the Mede kingdom, and sure enough, they found the decree there, right? And if you were to just do a little bit of historical research, you would find that the classical writers called this city Ecbatana, all right? So it's the same place, it's identical. Both of those names are used synonymously for this city, and it is a storied city. And as a side note, this detail about Ecbatana is a fascinating proof along with thousands and thousands of others, of the Bible's accuracy. Right? And so we know today from archaeological records that the Persian kings would spend their winters in the warm climate of Babylon, and then their summers they would retreat to the mountains of Ecbatana, which is in the modern country of Iran, and there in that cooler climate they would spend their summers there. So specifically, archaeological findings have revealed that King Cyrus went to Ecbatana in the spring of the year 538 BC. And he was there during the very summer that he would have issued this decree. So why is that significant? Well, I'd mentioned in our introduction a bit about some of the questions that liberal scholars have because they doubt the veracity of every book of the Bible. But if liberal scholars are right and some random guy was throwing the book of Ezra together several hundred years after the events, way over in the city of Jerusalem, there's no way that he would have known this sort of detail. Right? And so the fact that he knew this detail reaffirms the fact that this is accurate history that we're reading. History backs up the narrative of the scripture at every turn. And so the officials searched, and they found Cyrus's decree from 20 years prior. And the decree that Cyrus had written is recorded for us in verses 3 through 5. Right? Word for word, that's what it said. And it proved that Cyrus had indeed given the Jews permission to rebuild their temple. And it was found also that he didn't just tell them that they could rebuild it, he also decreed that the Persians would fund that project, which of course was a really big deal, right? And it noted that he had returned the vessels that Nebuchadnezzar had taken when he destroyed the original temple in Jerusalem. So this was a big find. Right? And of course, the Jews knew that this decree had existed. They didn't doubt that, but stuff like this tends to conveniently disappear in the hands of government or others who don't want them to exist. But this one didn't. Right? Darius found the decree. He diligently had his servants search until they found it, and he was committed to honoring it. And so then in verses 6 through 12, Darius responded by issuing his own decree, layering on top of what Cyrus had already decreed. God continued to work in the decree that Darius sent in response. So, and remember, we're talking about a pagan Persian king who really has no vested interest in the things of God and has his own false deities that he worships. So God is overseeing and directing this situation in a very special way. So next we find, secondly, that Darius provided for the work. And again, this is revealed in verses 6 through 12. And specifically, he granted 3 generous blessings to the Jews in the decree that he made. The first blessing that he granted was permission to continue building. Verses 6 and 7 spell that out for us. So remember that the governor Tatnai had asked if he should shut down the project. And Darius answered with a resounding no. You should not shut down the project. In fact, he told Tatnai and any other Persian officials, be ye far from thence. Let the work of this house of God alone. Now, folks, that is exactly, if you're a Jew, that is exactly what you wanted to hear. So remember from Ezra chapter 4 that the Samaritans had already come in and offered to help. They wanted to get involved. They wanted to put their own fingerprints on the building of the temple. But the Jews had rejected their offer because they knew that God wanted a holy people to build this temple exactly as God wanted it built. And when they had refused that assistance, it had cost them. It had cost them a lot. And the Samaritans got angry that they rejected their offer, and they made life really difficult. To all the way to the point, of course, of stalling out the temple work by purchasing favor in the Persian court and putting an evil bug in the king's ear. And so verses 6 and 7 are exactly what the Jews wanted to hear, right? Persian officials and anybody else, any other officials in the area, get out, stay far away, do not interfere. And the Jews, of course, didn't want anybody else sticking their fingers in the project or getting involved. They just wanted to be left alone to work. And so Darius decreed that everybody was to stay away from the project. And then the second blessing that he granted was provision for the work. And this is found in verses 8 through 10. So this one is huge. Because if you consider what we've already looked at with the Jewish people who had repopulated that area, the Jews were probably struggling to finance this massive project. Right? There were only about 42,000 total people who had come back, and they had homes, and they had lands, and they had lives that they were trying to build as well, in addition to this project. They didn't have jobs, they didn't have any gainful employment, they didn't have sources of income. And so this was a very expensive undertaking to rebuild this temple. Now, Cyrus had said that Persia would pay for it. But considering everything that the Jews had been through, how likely was it that they were going to go and ask the king for help? Would you please honor your word and open the royal coffers? I mean, if they asked him for help, then at the least the project was going to be back on his radar, which they really didn't want, and he was going to get involved, right? He might shut them down entirely. He might want to change what they were doing. He might want to add different design features or requirements to the building project since he was helping to pay for it. And so the text gives us no indication that the Jews had asked for help, even though they had a legal right to funding based on Cyrus's decree. And they were just trying to struggle through this project by themselves. And as a result, you have to know that they had to be elated to hear the king's command. And when he said, Tatnai, you fund the entire project from the royal treasury, from the royal taxes that you collect from that side of the river. And it's just a little bit ironic and funny to imagine how frustrated the Samaritans must have been when they heard that their tax dollars is now going to help fund the temple that they despised so much. I mean, they had to have been infuriated by that news. And it's all the more evident that God was at work. And notice that Darius didn't just pay for the construction alone. He wanted to provide everything that the Jews needed for their worship. Everything they needed for their sacrifices. In fact, verse 9 includes some pretty specific details that are very unique to Jewish worship and unique to the Old Testament law. And that probably means that Darius had solicited and received a lot of Jewish input in Babylon and how he wrote this decree. Right? So the various types of sacrifices and offerings that are mentioned, those are very specific in the Old Testament law. And you can imagine that this little project would generally be very inconsequential compared to all the other business that Darius had on his desk on any given day as he ruled over that massive expanse of the Persian Empire. And he gives such precision detail and so much time to this one project. God was working in some incredible ways here. And so Darius didn't do just the least that he could, the least that he was legally obligated to do to clear this matter off of his desk. He likely had Jewish counselors whom he gathered around him and helped him know exactly what was needed in order to do this right? And so again, imagine how amazing it must have been for the Jews to hear this decree. The Persian emperor is giving us exactly what we need. Right? God is working for us, finally making some forward progress in this. And then the third blessing that Darius granted was protection from enemies. And this is in verses 11 and 12, all right? And so now, verse 11 is a great verse if you really like theatrics and if you like vivid descriptions, all right? So this is way outside the scope of what we know in Western culture, but Darius said, if anybody at all interferes with the Jews, Tatnai, you are supposed to go in, you are supposed to destroy his house, you're supposed to take one of the major beams out of the house, and you are to sharpen the end of that beam, essentially turning it into a huge skewer. Right? And then he is supposed to impale the offender on that big skewer. Now, that was something that was regularly practiced in the Persian Empire. Sometimes they mercifully killed the person before they stuck the large skewer through their body. And sometimes they didn't. And sometimes the guy didn't die right away when he was skewered. Right? I mean, it was pretty gruesome. And so then they would leave the body hanging on the beam for potentially days while it decayed, out in the open, out in the heat for everybody to see, and allowing the birds and all the other scavengers to come and just slowly gnaw on the body, right? I mean, it was an intense and a humiliating statement about what happens if you disobey the Persians. And the Persians were basically saying, if you mess with us, that will be you, right? And anybody looking on would say, I don't want that to be me. And they would make sure that they strictly obeyed the Persian law. And of course, if you know the Old Testament history, right around this time period, you know that that's exactly what happened to a man by the name of Haman in the story of Esther. When you read about the gallows in the book of Esther, that wasn't a device for hanging somebody by a rope from the neck until dead like we know from the American West, all right? It's not even talking about crucifying them, although crucifixion was certainly a spin-off of this, and it was invented by the Persians right around this same time period that we're studying. But the gallows in the book of Esther were this big skewer that they would push through a body and elevate it for everybody to see. And so what's incredible is that by attaching this threat to the command not to interfere with the Jews, Darius was saying that an attack against the Jews is an attack against me and an attack against the Persian government, right? So he couldn't be much stronger in the ultimatum that he gave. If anybody resisted the Jews, they were resisting the order of the emperor of the most powerful empire in the world. So if the Samaritans or anybody else was tempted to interfere with this project and make life difficult, Darius made it plain, don't even think about it. Don't be tempted to do it. Don't mess with the Jews, because if you mess with them, you mess with me, and you're going to end up on a spit, all right? So this was a very strong deterrent to the Jews' enemies, and it was a tremendous moment of victory for the Jews. And notice again how he closed the decree in verse 12. He said, and the God that hath caused his name to dwell there destroy all kings and people that shall put to their hands to alter and to destroy this house of God which is at Jerusalem. I, Darius, have made a decree, let it be done with speed. And it is truly incredible. And so imagine the response from Zerubbabel and Jeshua the high priest and the people when they heard this read for the very first time. I mean, what a moment. You can just imagine, some of them were probably crying. Some of them were probably shouting for joy, and others were standing there speechless, just didn't know what to say. I mean, it was an incredible moment. These Persian kings were not good people. They were not moral people. They did not care about the religion of the Jews or about the Lord God. I mean, they were evil, power-hungry, murderous, egotistical men. And yet here was King Darius saying, I'm standing with the Jews, and I'm going to protect them from all threats against them and against their project. And above all else, of course, it is a powerful testimony to the power and the rule of God in the affairs of men. And God once again proved the truth of Proverbs chapter 21 and verse 1. The king's heart is in the hand of the Lord as the rivers of water. He turneth it whithersoever he will. And as powerful and intimidating as Darius surely was, he couldn't resist God's power, God's authority, even at the level of his own heart. And so, we like to think that if there's anything that we have control over, we have control over our own affections, our own hearts. But God makes it plain here that he rules over all things, and he can influence anything that he wants to accomplish his purposes. And in this case, there was a very critical purpose in redemptive history that needed to get done. And the same, of course, is true today, right? For example, over the last 3 years, we have watched in horror and we have grieved as Vladimir Putin has tried to assert his glory and his power and his strength on the world scene, leading to the killing and the genocidal behavior towards many people, innocent people in Ukraine and even in his own nation. But he doesn't rule supreme. He doesn't even rule his own heart. And with a simple flick, God could turn his heart whenever he wants to. And he can do the same with any other person, no matter how powerful or how evil they may be. Psalm 2 and verse 4 gives a very vivid picture when it says that when human powers shake their fists in the face of God, he that sitteth in the heavens shall laugh. The Lord shall have them in derision. And so our God is infinitely greater than any human power. And furthermore, this decree is a powerful testimony to the faithfulness of God. And so I imagine that as Tat and I read this decree, and the Jews were all assembled together listening to it being read the first time, many of the Jews probably looked over at Haggai and Zechariah as this was read, right? Who were surely standing there with the people as well. And remember, they had spoken to the people, and they had given them some incredible promises from God just within that year, that if they just stepped out in faith and they obeyed God and they began to work, God would take care of them, he would bless them, and they would finish the temple, right? Those were the direct promises of God that had just been given to them. And so I bet that a lot of people were throwing some sideways glances, like I see some of you do once in a while in the auditorium, and probably at the time they were probably looking at Haggai and Zechariah and thinking, you guys are crazy, right? There is no way that it's going to work out that way, right? There's no way that the Persians are going to let us do that. But God kept his promises. And so this decree that came from the pen of Darius just shouted out God's faithfulness. And against all human odds, he did exactly what he said he would do. He worked on behalf of his people. He fulfilled his word. And all of that should encourage us tremendously that we can trust God as well at all times. He is the same yesterday and today and forever. And when he makes a promise, he always fulfills it. And so we should give thanks that our lives are not subject to chance and to chaos, but rather that our lives are in the hands of a faithful God. And so in summary so far, God did something absolutely incredible in moving Darius to write this decree. But of course, God wasn't done, right? The temple still needed to be finished. And so we continue on in verses 13 through 18, which add that God enabled Israel to build. So after the decree from Darius arrived in Jerusalem, verse 13 continues. Then Tatnai, governor on this side the river, Shethar-Boznai, and their companions, according to that which Darius the king had sent, so they did speedily. And the elders of the Jews builded, and they prospered through the prophesying of Haggai the prophet and Zechariah the son of Iddo. And they builded and finished it according to the commandment of the God of Israel, and according to the commandment of Cyrus, and Darius, and Artaxerxes, king of Persia. And this house was finished on the 3rd day of the month Adar, which was in the 6th year of the reign of Darius the king. And the children of Israel, the priests and the Levites, and the rest of the children of the captivity kept the dedication of this house of God with joy, and offered at the dedication of this house of God 100 bullocks, 200 rams, 400 lambs, and a sin offering for all Israel, 12 he-goats, according to the number of the tribes of Israel. And they set the priests in their divisions, and the Levites in their courses for the service of God, which is at Jerusalem, as it is written in the book of Moses. Now, Darius had said that his decree must be done or carried out with speed, right? And Tatnai did just that. So verse 13 says, in reference to that, so they did speedily. Now, the words speed and speedily obviously reference doing something fast. But the Hebrew word behind those two words has a further nuance or a broader nuance than just doing something fast or hastily. It also has the nuance of doing something thoroughly and eagerly and diligently, right? So, I mean, it is enthusiastically carried out to the extreme. And so they got after it immediately, and they did it well. And so just imagine, once again, Tatnai marching back into Jerusalem several months after his first visit. And the first time he had come in to inspect the work and to ensure that they were not defying the king, and it had put the Jews on edge, and they were on pins and needles waiting for Tatnai to return and give them the final judgment from Darius. And here he came, right? But this time, he didn't come with soldiers. This time he came with wagons of money and loads of supplies, and flocks and herds of the exact kinds of sacrificial animals. that they needed. And big promises, right? And he assured the Jews that he would supply whatever they needed from that time on, and otherwise they would all just stay out of the way, right? And so the Jews rejoiced, and they got right to work. And so verses 13 through 15 declare that with the full support of the Persian Empire, Israel finished the temple, right? Now, I do want to emphasize that there was still a lot of work to do here, right? Chapter 4 and verse 24 said that they resumed work during Darius's second year as king in 520 BC. And chapter 6 and verse 15 says that they didn't finish until his sixth year, which would be 516 BC, right? And so this was a big project. 4 years of intense labor and work. And even with the king's help, I'm sure that there were some frustrating, hard days when things didn't go as planned. Workers weren't doing what they were supposed to do. People got discouraged. Maybe they got irritated with one another. And so it's interesting that verse 14 says that all the while, Haggai and Zechariah continued to encourage the people day by day, bringing them messages from the Lord to strengthen their faith and to keep them going and to keep them focused with the right perspective on the work that they were doing. And so with that encouragement and with that guidance and direction, finally it says they builded and finished it according to the commandment of the God of Israel and according to the commandment of Cyrus and Darius and Artaxerxes, king of Persia. Now, you might look at that and think that it's kind of curious that Artaxerxes is included here because he actually didn't come along for 50 more years. And I was going to show you the timeline and the chart once again as to where he fits in. But he comes later on, about 50 years later. And so the author, as I'd mentioned before, is probably the author of the books of Ezra and Nehemiah together. And so he would have been writing at the end of that time period when he could look back and see the entire scope of the work that had been done, as well as all the Persian kings that were involved in that project. So Artaxerxes, as we'll see when we get to later on here in this book and then into Nehemiah, he was the one that sanctioned the second and the third returns and the work of Ezra and Nehemiah, those two men, right? So at this point, Ezra's not even on the scene, right? So the author is really just stepping back after the project was completed, and he's taking a broad historical view of how God used these three Persian emperors to fulfill his promises to Israel and to rebuild the city and the temple and the walls, all right, because they were all instrumental in rebuilding all those things. But ultimately, God did all of these incredible things because verse 14 doesn't give ultimate credit to these three kings. It says that it was the commandment of the God of Israel that these kings obeyed. And so even the most powerful men on earth must obey when God commands them to act. And he's more powerful than the greatest of men. And so by God's decree, Israel finished the temple. And from there, they dedicated to the temple. And secondly, they restored the worship and the service of God. And we find this in verses 16 through 18. So verse 17 mentions all the animals that were sacrificed at the dedication of this new temple. And the numbers may sound really big to us. I mean, it's 100 bulls and 200 rams and 400 lambs and 12 goats. I mean, that is a lot of meat. And these were not burnt offerings that would have been completely consumed. These were fellowship offerings that would have been shared and that would have been eaten. And so, I mean, they had a massive barbecue, right? This is a massive feast at that time. But if you know the rest of the Bible history, you know that those numbers were only a fraction of what Solomon had used when he dedicated the first temple. 1 Kings chapter 8 and verse 63 tells us that Solomon had offered 22,000 oxen and 120,000 sheep when he dedicated the first temple. And it's a big difference, but that was okay. Remember what the prophets had said, not to despise the day of small things, all right? So just doing a numerical comparison between the temples and the temple size and the number of sacrifices is not what God was focused on. God was at work here. He was providing for and he was blessing this small group of people who had returned and worked faithfully for God. And one other difference that we see here between Solomon's offerings and the offerings in the days of Zerubbabel is that this time they offered a sin offering for each tribe, right? So that's interesting because in reality, only 3 tribes of Israel remained, right? Judah and Benjamin and Levi. And those were the 3 tribes that were represented in the returnees that had gone back. The other 9 tribes weren't even represented in Judah, but the people who were present had a vision for the entire nation. And in particular, they acknowledged that the entire nation had sinned against the Lord. And they deserved the judgment that they had endured. But now they sought God's forgiveness for the entire nation. And so this is an amazing day. I mean, think about the fact that it had been exactly 70 years, almost to the day, right? From 586 BC to 616, since Israel had been able to worship God in the temple. But God was gracious, and he was faithful despite Israel's sin. And so he brought them home, and he restored their ability to draw near to him in worship in his house with the orderliness and the propriety and the excellence and the attention to detail that God's worship always deserves. It takes enough time to mention in the text the order of the Levites and the courses of the priests and how they were set in such disciplined arrangement in their different functions in the house of God. God's worship always deserves the best. But God still was not done, right? So finally, verses 19 through 22 add for us the detail that God inspired Israel to worship, right? And so these verses conclude the chapter by recording, beginning in verse 19, and the children of the captivity kept the Passover upon the 14th day of the first month. For the priests and the Levites were purified together. All of them were pure, and killed the Passover for all the children of the captivity, and for their brethren the priests, and for themselves. And the children of Israel, which were come out again out of the captivity, and all such as had separated themselves unto them from the filthiness of the heathen of the land, to seek the Lord God of Israel, did eat, and kept the feast of unleavened bread 7 days with joy, for the Lord had made them joyful, and turned the heart of the king of Assyria unto them, to strengthen their hands in the work of the house of God, the God of Israel. So the temple, we see, was dedicated in the month Adar, right? And that's roughly March on our calendar. And then these verses say that about a month later, they observed the Passover. Now, they had been observing the Passover ever since they set up the altar on the temple site about 20 years prior. But this was the first time in 70 years that they were able to celebrate it in a rightful temple. And so this was a really big deal. All right? And verses 20 and 21 emphasize that they celebrated this Passover with purity. They were very careful to do this right, folks. And the priests and the Levites, it says, were purified together. And they only welcomed such as had separated themselves unto them from the filthiness of the heathen of the land. And those might seem like very minor details at a cursory reading, but for generations before the captivity, Israel was rarely careful to follow the law precisely. Everything that Israel had done for a very long time prior to the captivity had been polluted and corrupted with paganism, with idol worship. And so the books of Kings and Chronicles critiques even the best kings of Israel, saying that they did not destroy the high places. Even if they followed the Lord with all their heart outside of that, they still left the high places. And so other kings brought pagan, not the good ones of the Israelite kings, but the worst of the Israelite kings, they brought pagan ideas into the very temple of the Lord. And so from the time of Solomon, when the first temple was built, everything was tainted by paganism and idolatry from that day forward. And of course, the captivity was terrible. It was horrible. It was destructive. It was violent. But God used it to purge Israel of idolatry. And Israel never struggled with idolatry again like they had before the captivity. The returnees were passionate about holiness, according to this text. And so they observed the Passover, and then they observed the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And so the Passover was always on the 14th day of the first month on the Jewish calendar, and the Feast of Unleavened Bread followed on days 15 through 21, right? Now, they were essentially just one celebration of Israel's deliverance from Egypt. And verse 22 emphasizes that the Jews celebrated with joy. Why did they celebrate with joy? Well, when you read through Bible narratives, verses like 22 should jump out at you, because here the author is backing out of telling the story, and he's telling us what he wants us, the readers, to see and to learn in the story. And in this case, he told his readers that they observed these times of worship and joy, for the Lord had made them joyful and turned the heart of the king of Assyria unto them to strengthen their hands in the work of the house of God, the God of Israel. Now, again, it may be surprising to somebody here that the narrator referred to Darius as the king of Assyria, because he was Persian, not Assyrian, right? But since Assyria was the first empire to rule that large part of the world, spanning same area, Syria, over to Mesopotamia and down to Egypt area, because of that, it was actually very common to refer to the Babylonian and Persian empires as Assyrian, right? In fact, we even have record of the great Greek historian Herodotus doing this same thing, and he called the Persian Empire the Assyrian Empire. Right? So it was commonplace in classical literature. So this wasn't just some forgetfulness on the part of the narrator. It was common practice of the day to refer to that region in that way. But notice that what the narrator really wanted to drive home as he closed out the first return from captivity. So yes, Cyrus made the original decree allowing the Jews to return and rebuild the temple. And yes, Darius allowed them to complete the work. But ultimately, all the credit goes to the Lord, because he is the one, it says, who turned the heart of the king. So God was in ultimate control, not any human power. And so the Jews rejoiced not in the king, but in the Lord, as they observed this particular feast. And God had done wonderful and marvelous works on their behalf. And so, what do we learn from this? I mean, what do we take away from this, and how can we apply it? Well, I'm going to give you 4 quick conclusions that you can apply to your life. And the first is this, that just as we've talked about all through this study tonight, God is sovereign, or he is in authority. He is in rule over all. Now, we've talked about this a lot today, and we've really talked about it a lot through the series as well, but it's important that we remember these fundamental truths about God constantly, because nearly all people in the world around us like to think that they are in charge, right? They command their own destiny, and people like to think that they're in control of their own lives, and powerful people want to believe that they stand on top, right? And again, that's what Psalm 2 is picturing or indicating, that all the people of the earth and those that are in authorities just shake their fist at God and say, let's break his bands asunder, right? But God alone is all-powerful. God alone is in authority. And of course we know this, but it's essential that we remind ourselves often, because so many voices in this world, and even voices within you and me, are constantly telling us the opposite. So, I mean, think about this. Your fears, your anxieties, your schedule, all the demands that are placed on you are always telling you that you are subject to all other sorts of powers and influences. Whether it's your own heart and your own will, or whether it's all of those outside influences. But we don't need to fear human powers. We don't need to bow to human masters, because God is the ruler yet. And he turns the hearts of kings wherever he wishes. And I'm not suggesting, as you know, that means that we just throw off all other authorities and don't respect or reverence, whether it's the government or an employer or in a home or in a church, right? There are authority structures God set up, but he ultimately rules supreme over all of those and gives delegated authority to them. And so there's nothing in this universe that trumps God's authority and power. And we need to recognize that, and we need to live that way. Trust him. Secondly, God is faithful. God is faithful, right? He is immutable, which means that he never changes. His character and his power are constant. He doesn't have good days and bad days. Thank God. right? He doesn't have days where he's apathetic and other days where he's fired up and emotional about everything. He's always righteous. He is always just. He is always good. He is always stable. He always keeps his promises. He's never flaky. He's never forgetful. He's never finicky. He always remembers, and he always acts rightly. You know, there are very few things in this life that you can truly count on, but you can bank everything on the faithfulness of God. God is faithful. And because of that, the third application is that you and I should constantly trust God's character. And this begins, of course, by entrusting him with your soul and with your eternity. Now, I probably haven't emphasized enough the fact that Ezra chapters 1 through 6 are a powerful testimony to the fact that God always keeps his redemptive promises. I mean, after all, these chapters are about something a lot bigger than 42,000 refugees and a building project. The whole process of them finishing the temple provided the picture of God's broader plan of bringing redemption into the world through Christ. These 42,000 people built this temple. And yes, there were some major additions and there were some major renovations that were eventually added by Herod the Great. But this temple, the one that they built, it was the very one that Jesus himself visited when he walked this earth. He taught in its very shadow. And then, of course, we know that Jesus died outside of Jerusalem to provide salvation for all who believed in him. And it was in this very temple that was constructed by these people that the veil was torn from the top to the bottom when he died on the cross. It pictured that the way into God's presence for man, for sinful man, was secured. It was obtained. And just as surely as Jesus died and then rose again, he'll someday return to finish God's plan to bring redemption and reconciliation to the world and reconcile all things to himself. And so you can trust your eternity to the gospel of Jesus Christ. And if you've never been saved, then trusting God's character begins with confessing that you've broken God's laws, that you have sinned against him, that you deserve hellfire, and then entrusting your soul to the salvation that Jesus provides. And you can do so, friend. You can do so trusting that he will keep his promise to save you. And if you've never been saved, then I plead with you, trust in him today and be saved. And if you are saved, trust God's character every single day, every moment of every day. We all have burdens. We all have fears. We all have anxieties. We all have disappointments. But whatever may be weighing on you, remember that God is bigger. God is faithful. And God is good. And so trust his character. And then fourthly, give thanks for God's blessings. So often, our problem is not that God never answers our prayers or gives us good things. Our problem is that we often don't make it. We often don't make it to verses 19 through 22 in our text here, right? We don't recognize the blessings of God and rejoice. So one of the reasons that God built so many feasts into Israel's annual calendar was to force them to constantly remember his works, to give thanks for those mighty works, for his deliverance, for his care, and to worship him for what those events said about his character. And so they would go through their calendar cyclically, and every year they would remember and recall and reverence God for those things and worship collectively together. We need these kind of disciplines also. And so the question is not ever, has God been faithful to me? Or has God been good to me? The question is, do I recognize his power and his purpose at work in my life? And do I give thanks for his good works? And so, for all of us, let's learn from the example of Israel. And let's make sure that we carefully see the hand of God all around us, permeating our lives, guiding us. And let's worship him for his abundant blessings. Worship him for his character, and worship him for his great works. Let's pray. Father, I give you thanks tonight for the opportunity that we've had to be able to open up your word and to consider this wonderful historical narrative that unpacks this great victory, these great and mighty works that you did for your people. And even more than that, the important part that this plays in redemptive history. And so we thank you for your kindness in sending your Son into this world and for how he walked into this very temple, taught there. And that temple so illustrative in many ways of the sacrifice that he was going to make. And then in that very temple, the curtain, the veil is torn from the top to the bottom when he died and cried out, "It is finished." And that work of having secured eternal redemption and access directly into your presence was purchased. Thank you for that. I thank you for the privilege of being able to trust in that. And oh Lord, I pray that you would impress on the heart of any lost person here tonight the desperate need that they have to believe in the gospel and to be saved before it's too late. And I pray that you would help each one of your children here to remember what we've studied tonight, to remember the great faithfulness of God, the power that you exercise over this universe, and that we are to be carefully submitted to you in all things. I thank you for this church. I thank you for the precious people that are here. We pray that you would apply your word to each of our hearts as you see fit. And I pray that as we continue to surrender individually and as a church body before you, that you would have total control here, and that you would see us as a church being shaped into the image of your precious Son, and that we would represent you well to this world around us. In Jesus' name.